Welcome to Constant Variables, a podcast where we take a non-technical look at building and growing digital products. I'm Tim Bornholt. Let's get nerdy.
Welcome to another episode in our Oofda series, where we bring on a technical subject matter expert and have a casual and approachable conversation to make said technical subject matter more relatable to those of us who may not work in tech every day. This episode with Eric Caron about APIs is sponsored by the Jed Mahonis Group, your partner, not your vendor, in building mobile and web apps that increase revenue and are enjoyable to use. Our decade-long experience building iOS, Android, and Ruby on Rails business tools has increased funding for startups, sped up the sales pipeline for small businesses, improved communication at growing mid-sized companies, and streamlined processes at enterprises to add millions to their bottom lines. See the value we can bring to your project by visiting jmg.mn.
Hey, Eric, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Tim. Thanks for having me back. Glad to be here.
I was telling you this kind of before we started, but you're the inspiration for doing this Oofda series because it hit me while we were talking last time, and you should definitely go back and check out our last conversation if you're listening to this now. But we were talking about APIs, and I was like, I wish we could just do an entire episode on just that. So I'm very excited to have you back so we can nerd out about APIs a little bit.
Yeah, that sounds great. When you first said that I'm back because of the Oofda series, I thought it was the Norwegian in me, but this makes a lot more sense. So good.
I mean, it could be either way. If you have any lefsa or both? Anything like that, I'm happy to oblige virtually here. So let's talk APIs. I mean, at a high level, again, this is an episode intended for people that may have to interact with APIs but seem to be intimidated or confused or anything around that topic. So maybe we should just start at the basics of what does API stand for and how do they work?
Sure. API stands for Developers Hate Naming Things. I think that the technical definition of it is Application Programming Interface, but that 3 words means as much as like any other random letters that you could pick up. Do you know what a recursive acronym is?
I do, like PHP.
Okay. Yep. Or like wine, where wine is not an emulator, and then the W is WINE, so it just keeps going in. Or news, not Linux, and it's GNU is not Unix. So it just shows that naming things is tough, and don't worry too much about what the acronym is or what the full name is, and it's like Latin or Greek roots. Just what does it do? And that's where, if you can get behind what does API mean, figure out what it does is where things get cool. And really, it's just 2 systems talking to each other. There's all sorts of different standards and formats and best practices, but at the very core of what an API is, it's just a way that developers of 2 different systems, it could be hardware and software, hardware and hardware, software and software, and it's a way that they agree to say, here's how my system is going to talk to you and your system's going to talk back. And when you understand it at that level, then things get really, really cool. For example, like 2 of my 3 kids have APIs in their rooms. They've got night lights that are wired up to a IoT button. And so right on their headboard, they push the button. And then that is just a little computer piece called a Raspberry Pi that connects to the light bulb in the room, which is running on, it's a Philips Hue light bulb. And that has an API. So their button tells the API of the light bulb, hey, turn on. And then the light bulb looks to a different system to say, okay, it's 3 a.m. I'm going to show them the red light that tells them to go back to bed. Or it's 7:30 a.m. and wow, they slept in. We're going to show them the yellow light and say it's okay to wake up. So APIs can be everywhere.
It's amazing. Like, I think a lot of times people feel like technology is just unapproachable and magic, and a lot of times I guess it is in many ways. Even like as someone that does it for a living, it's still sometimes magical to me. But I think the concept of an API is really important to anyone that actually is trying to do something with somebody else, because all it is to my understanding of it's really just two people trying to negotiate how they're going to talk to each other. If you're the one like that's giving up data, you want to say, hey, if you ask me a question this way, then I will give you an answer this way. And then that way you can tell your own systems what to do with that data passing back and forth. But yeah, I think it's really cool. Like I'm just really jealous that your kids are interested in having Raspberry Pis in their room, because I'm trying to get my 5-year-old to start being interested in tech, and to not great success, but we'll get there.
Yeah. Well, the microbit would be another one to start with. Also, we can have another hardware podcast next. But yeah, the microbit, where you can have your kid make their own little wristwatch, and that wristwatch can have a little internet piece in it, and then that can talk to anything else in the house. And like, I didn't use the word API once in that sentence, but if we're going to get like truly technical and nerdy on it, every single piece of it is a API, from the kids' hardware to the trying to come up with an example that isn't a light bulb in the house. I want to talk treadmills pretty soon, but I can't think of a good segue to it.
Well, that's all right. I think the long and short of it is, I think people use APIs every single day, and unless you work in tech, you don't even really realize it. And you've already kind of gone through on the personal side, like how APIs could work, but maybe from a business standpoint, are there any examples that you can think of like how an API would help make your business function, I guess?
Sure. One of my first startups, we built on an API first mentality. And what that meant was every single component of the business, and it was the name of it was TrackIf. It's been rebranded since then, but it let you track anything that changed on the internet. So if you wanted to know if a house went on sale, if you wanted to know that the PlayStation 5 is back in stock, it let you track that. So each different system, the one that would monitor those websites to see if data changed, the one that would let you say, I want to track this, the one that would say, and when a change happens, sends me an email. Each individual component of it was its own API. So that way, as the company grew, the company changed, we had different third parties that we wanted to interact with. We were able to have them talk straight to our API if they didn't want to route through our email system, but instead they wanted to push it through their own mobile app. Absolutely. Where our email comes from the same system that your app will. So API first mentality there, really, it was great for the startup because it let us stay super flexible. My next big foray with APIs was at Best Buy on the actual Best Buy API team. And this one, it was such a cool job. I learned so many different parts of it. And you can go to github.com/bestbuy and see, because as one of the first movers in the space, a lot of educators would give their class assignment to say, oh, you don't know what an API is, go to Best Buy, sign up for it. And after 5 years of all of these teachers putting in their curriculum, at the start of every semester, we would have this onslaught of students emailing us at Best Buy for homework support. So it showed that there was an interest out there in learning APIs, and that more students and classrooms needed ways to experiment with it. So we came up with what we called the API Playground, which was kind of the Best Buy API in a box. So then the professors and students could run their own system and actually see how things were working behind the scenes. And that taught me so much, both in how important documentation is, how important code examples are. And I'm happy that a lot of that stuff is still up today.
Yeah, that kind of brings it into like kind of, I guess, the next level, because I think APIs in general it's an easy concept to understand, right? Like someone has data that they want to get to somebody else, and you're trying to hand that data off. But even within just that, I mean, there's a lot of places we could take this, of like the documentation is a big one. I mean, I'm sure you've worked with APIs where it's like you have to kind of you're kind of in the dark and you're kind of holding your arm out in front of you of like, okay, maybe if I try this variable, or maybe if I send the date in this format, maybe it'll work. So you've got kind of APIs like that. And then you've got APIs that are, extremely well documented and robust, where it tells you down to the, micro detail of how things work documentation wise.
Oh, well, there's so many different levels of documentation. On one hand, you've got the people that here's a couple curl examples, and that's how you use our API, which is just awful. You've got the other end of the spectrum where Google's API documentation explains what the word true and what the word false mean. You're like, that's great, but I didn't want to have to page through 172 pages to understand how I check what the directions are from my house to a local store. I think Twilio is always referenced on every single API conversation. It's cliche for people that live and breathe APIs, but they do it right. Their documentation is easy to understand, and it's that combination of documentation and code examples. Because the code samples also show that they've used it and tested it. There's no promise in the world that a documentation is actually going to be an accurate reflection of what the coders did. It's actually a promise and a commitment that the company makes that when a developer launches a new feature, that somebody, and not always the developer, is going to go into the documentation and publish an update. So when you see those documents of APIs that also include, here is a snippet of code for you to reproduce it yourself, then it's a trustworthy API that you can have in your ecosystem as a first-class citizen.
I would echo what you said about Twilio. And I think another company that I've seen that does it really well is Stripe. Because anytime I've ever had to do Stripe integrations, you can pick what platform you're on, and they have code examples, and they walk you through exactly how things need to mesh up. So you're right. I think it takes a concerted effort. We can talk about, what it would take to publish an API. It might be a good place to move this conversation. But I think if you are putting your API out there to the world, I mean, you have to be able to give people a good way to access it. And I mean, you can take it as far as you want to with, I think it'd be really interesting to see what Google's definition of truth and false, would be. Cause I that's an interesting philosophical question we've all been wondering for generations. But, I think at a minimum, there's a good balance to strike of how much information you give out when you're putting your API out there in the world.
Well, actually, I'm going to take note. You said it twice in that sentence, so that's why I feel comfortable picking on you with that, and I think you're awesome, so you can handle it. It's not about putting it out there to the world. This concept of a public API that anybody, any basement developer can go to your website and sign up for a key, that's fun, but it's also really hard to come up with a business model that explains why you need to take your API and make it public. But all APIs, even if it's not public, should have good documentation. If your system at your small startup that's just you and your brother, if you've got two different systems, you owe it to both yourself in 6 months that's not going to remember what you did today, and then your 800th employee once you've had your Series C and everything is going amazing. If you start launching your first API with documentation at that point, that's there's a standard out there called Open API. It used to be called Swagger. It's really lightweight. Everybody accepts it in their clients for how to do documentation examples. But even internally, document your APIs so that when you're trying to figure out, hey, how do I get this customer's address? Well, I'm not having to find a business analyst or a developer to explain to me the Python code that I don't know how to read. I just go to the documentation, and right there, it's, this is how I get that data. So API documentation should absolutely be done for every situation, not just when you have a world-facing API.
Good point. You caught me, and I will take that. I will take that with grace, because you're right. I think that's one distinction that we haven't gotten to yet of a public versus a private API, and I guess that you're right. Like, there is no real good business case for Best Buy, for example, to say, hey, here's an API for accessing how much money we made yesterday, and here's all of our employees' social security numbers. Like, those are obviously APIs that very likely exist within Best Buy, because that data needs to move around from division to division. But I don't think, well, Circuit City's not in business anymore. That's a terrible example. Amazon doesn't need to know what Best Buy's current situation is. And, from your standpoint, it's not like Starbucks needs to know what's going on with your internal stuff too. So I guess when it comes to like doing a public versus private API, is it just pretty obvious like that? Or are there any other like examples of like when you would want to make a API publicly consumable, I guess?
I would say there's two reasons. One is from a business and one is from a pragmatic standpoint. From the business perspective, if your API is something that could make you money, so for example, if you develop a brand new system that always has incredibly accurate weather forecasts, well, don't just create a website and everyone has to go to it and visit and type in a password. Like, weather forecasts integrate into every different walk of life we have. So make a public API and let people pay for it and then use that data however they want. From a pragmatic standpoint, it's a lot more like open source code. Like, just because I have these 7 lines of code that I really am proud of, it doesn't mean I should publish them on Ruby Gems or NPM and now release it to the world. Like, open source is great, but first look around to see, is there something out there that already does it? And if not, are you willing to stand behind it and support it and keep it running? Because if you make a public API, you're making that commitment. People might build their business on you, and so you owe it to them to be able to scale it and support it long term. Or if you do sunset it, to be able to give people enough heads up to say, yeah, sorry, this didn't work out and I'm not making enough money off of it to keep it running, so I'm going to turn it off. Troy Hunt at Have I Been Pwned, his work with his API for that platform has been a wonderful use case of it, where he put it up there, it started to get hammered, he found a way to keep it somewhat profitable, and he's been in communication with the community the whole time to say, you know what, I'm not having a lot of fun on this. Does anybody want to take this over? And then along the way, he found his passion. So there's reasons out there to have a public API, but don't just assume that, hey, this is an API, let's make it public. Like, try to find your reason first.
Yeah, because I think that's one thing. I think we talked about this last time, actually, was like, when you have a thing that you put out into the world, people love putting things out into the world, but don't love necessarily, taking care of them at a minimum. And then when they are ready to be retired, it's really painful sometimes to pull something back out of the world. So I think you're right. Like, you got to have a good reason for wanting to publish this information, because once you put it out there, people will build some obscure system that if you take away that API, some building over in the Netherlands will just crumble to the ground because it's reliant on your weird weather API that you put out there.
Do you remember earlier how I wanted to talk about treadmills, but I couldn't think of the segue?
Do you have the segue now?
You just gave me my segue.
Yes.
Thank you. Hardware is an example where sometimes you can call it APIs or software developer kits. But let's say I'm going to make a treadmill, and I want that treadmill to have hardware in it that I can track to see like the weight of the user, how like at this time they were running this fast, what percentage of their steps hit in the middle, what hit on the outside. That's cool. And if I have a cloud-based service that can track all of that data, solid. But let's say that treadmill manufacturer goes out of business. Well, I don't want a machine that's just sitting in the corner that now just turned into a basic $200 treadmill when I spent $2,000 on it because I was expecting all of this cloud connectivity. If the hardware manufacturer, when they're putting this out to the world, also releases the API to say how I can talk to this hardware, if it's in my house and that cloud system goes away, all sorts of third parties can say, you know what, Hank's running cloud service.com is out of business, but I can maintain it and integrate it with my own. There's this what's the name of it? It's Gymnasticon. There it is. So if it's Gym Nasticon, and I'm sure we'll put it in the show notes. But this open source project just finds all of this cloud connected exercise hardware, and they figure out how to connect to it. So even if a system goes out of business, you can still do all sorts of smart stuff with this hardware that you've invested in. So I guess in that sense, it's kind of a public API that it's hardware and it's in my house. So I'm just teaching my local house to connect to it. But it's also proof that when you buy something, whether or not it's a SaaS solution in the cloud or something in your house, doesn't hurt to look to see what documentation's available in case the provider goes out of business.
First of all, we were talking about naming things, and Gymnasticon. I don't even know.
I think it's a reference to like the old bikes.
Okay, that's fair. Okay. That is actually cool. I was wondering, like, I didn't know how to bring this up, but like, I think the weirdest thing about having kids was like being in the hospital and then staring at this thing and being responsible to name it. Because like, I can't name apps, let alone naming a human being. Like why we are given that permission, I will never know. But
that's why I'm so lucky to have my wife. Otherwise, it would be child 1, 2, and 3. But she took on naming them.
Well, at least we didn't name them the same thing that Elon Musk named their kid, because
oh yeah, that random character.
Yes, that okay. But yeah, that's a really great point. Like, and that's the stuff that APIs can enable, and that's kind of the part of the magic too. Like, I've been getting more into hardware lately as well, and I think finding a way. So I'm thinking through how this would work in my head, because your treadmill, when you probably connect your treadmill to the internet, so it's speaking out to the world using a certain protocol that the treadmill manufacturer put out there. But what you're doing instead when that doesn't respond is before it even goes out to the internet, you're intercepting that call and grabbing it locally on your own computer or whatever hardware you have in your house to grab that data, and then you're processing it locally. Is that essentially what's happening?
Yeah. And my real non-made up example is I've got a rowing machine, and the rowing machine, when I bought it, I noticed it had a little USB port in the back. Could not figure out why it was. Went online, found the documentation. Oh, this rowing machine is actually putting out calories and distance and speed. So then I built just a little API that listens, it runs on a Raspberry Pi, plugs into the USB, and then it just echoes out whatever's happening on it. And then I can build a different single page application that consumes the data that API is kicking out. And all of a sudden, I've got a web-based presentation that shows how I'm looking. So rather than looking at the little LED screen that's 1 inch by 2 inch, I've got a 13-inch monitor in front of it that shows kind of a picture of me rowing, and then it records my past self, and then I can see how I'm doing against the Eric that was rowing last week. And that's all because the documentation on that exercise equipment published, and again, SDK and API, you can kind of use them interchangeably here. It published, here's what data is getting pushed out of there. So even if Water Rower goes out of business, my system will live on until I stop having interest in rowing.
I was going to say, so now you put in all this work to build this. Now, are you actually rowing?
Oh, God. My wife paid you to say that, didn't she? No, it's when you come up with that feature and you're like, I don't want to have to push the start button. I want the system to know that on my first pull to start the counter. All right, run downstairs, do some JavaScript, push an update, and then try it again. No, my workouts are not nearly as effective as they ought to be.
I think, I mean, you held my feet to the fire earlier, so that just because I was putting myself in your shoes, and I'm like, I've been there where you have an activity that you're dreading doing, so then you try to find ways to make it fun, but what you're actually having fun doing is building this interconnected system to do the thing that you're trying to avoid doing.
Yeah, it's the maker's curse. It's just fun to build things, and then when you actually use it, then you understand how you can improve it.
So I guess bringing this back to some things that our listeners can take away instead of how nerdy we both are. What would you say are some common misconceptions about APIs?
I would say a lot of the start of bad API decisions is on very, very nerdy topics like versioning. There's 112 different ways that you can slice it. And if you look at some solutions like Yext, for example, has an API out there that in every single call you make to it, you can put the date and the system will perform identical to how the API existed on that date. I don't know how the heck they do that, because I would imagine that involves them running 38, like every time there's a release, they have to run that server forever. But they do it, and I'm very lucky that they do it. Until you get to the point where you're a publicly traded company, you don't need to worry about that much. For versioning, I like to just have like a V1 in the URL. And then until you change something that makes it that the API breaks, and I used to send everything as camel case, and now everything is underscore. Don't worry about the V1.0.7. Just it's V1 of your API until you really, really break something. So don't worry about versioning. The other one would be the API management solutions. There are a ton of players in that place, from Apigee, which Google acquired. Kong has a really good solution. Don't worry about setting up a tremendously huge infrastructure around your APIs until you get to the point that you've got so much volume that you can't avoid it. Azure has a great API manager. AWS has a great API manager. Take your code, put it behind an API management, because you want your API to just be a weather widget. You don't want it to be a weather widget and have a full user management system and have a full billing system and have a full throttling system. Take your API, keep it small, and then put it behind a cost-effective solution like Azure's API Manager, and then trust that system to do things like authentication, throttling, billing, logging, documentation can be stored there. So that would be the two big things. Is don't worry too much about versioning. Find an API management solution you like, but recognize that try to find one that is cost effective based on your volume, rather than 90% of your annual hosting is on an API management layer that only gets 12 hits a month.
Yeah, I those are great pieces of advice if you're looking at building your own API. One thing I was thinking about because I Jenny helps me write these questions, right? A lot of the times. And so I try to think through like how I would answer them. And one thing that I was thinking of with like a really common misconception with an API is like, just because somebody has an API doesn't mean that API is going to give you what you want. So like the example being like, I guess if you were to ping Facebook and say, I guess we talked about this before with like, if I were to go to look at Best Buy's APIs and I say, I want to get all of Best Buy's financial information from yesterday, likely that's not going to be there because they don't have to put that out there. So I think as far as APIs go, it really is that agreement of like whoever has the data has to tell you what data is going to be put in there. And that's what you're stuck with. Like just because a company may have an API out there and publish it, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get what you want. Another one that I think of from like a recent case example was we were thinking about we were talking with somebody about building an app to help with something in the real estate space. And if you've ever done anything with real estate APIs, you'll know that MLS is the kingpin in that area, and they're pretty particular about who consumes their data and how often you can consume their data and in what ways you can consume their data. And so you get kind of put into a box unless you're willing to shell out the shekels for sure to be able to get that information as you want. But that's I think that could be like a common misconception that I see from time to time from people that are looking to build things that integrate with other things is you can only build as far as people are willing to give you the data that you're looking for.
Yeah, we got two overlapping topics here, and it's important to recognize why they're overlapping. One is how you choose an API that you consume and that you have your business interact with, and then how you build an API that others would interact with. And I think it's important to know that everybody should consume other APIs. Not everybody needs to be creating their own, But I would never want to have a developer creating an API unless they also have experience using others' APIs. The whole ecosystem works well because there's so much prior art and similar patterns between the APIs. The worst API is somebody that was just feeling creative and made up a pattern that it doesn't absolutely match anything else. And I was 100% that person. I was building an API for websites to try to it was basically like a Delicious or a StumbleUpon competitor. And I was getting so clever with the HTTP status codes, which is when you're giving data to a web browser and API, you can say here's the data you want, or we all know the 404 code that says, yeah, what you were looking for, no idea, buddy, sorry. So I was getting really clever there, and I created all sorts of Ruby developers that I still probably should send them some apology flowers. So don't get clever. Just be use what other people are using, and it'll make your APIs a lot easier to consume. Going back to the topic of consumption, you brought up Facebook, and it's a trigger for me, so we're going to lean into it. When you're having your business interact with another API, the very first thing that you should look at isn't how do I push the data into it. It's how do I get the data out of it? Because unless you are explicitly working with a vendor that is going to own the data, every API that you should interact with should be able to let you pull your data out of the system. So it's a very good data privacy and data management perspective. So that's my little, I'll only do one PSA. I think I did 7 PSAs in our last episode. But the PSA is that when you're selecting an API, don't just think about how do I push data into it. Look at how you pull data out of it.
Well, I don't think there's been a episode of Constant Variables in the last year where I haven't said something snarky about Facebook. So I guess this just continues the streak. I think one thing along that line too, we could definitely branch into how we're going to be doing selecting APIs, because I think one thing you mentioned of we should think about how you're going to get data out of it as opposed to putting it in there. I think you should also think about how long is that vendor going to stick around for. Like we just talked about with the treadmill, your vendor could just up and poof and go away. But also there's cases where there are companies, other social networks, Twitter, where at one point it was very advantageous to their business model to provide robust API support for applications to pull tweets out and to look at all these cool fancy things that Twitter was enabling. But then all of a sudden Twitter was realizing, hey, if we tighten the screws on these APIs a little bit and give less information out, then that'll force people to start using it won't force people to use the main Twitter app, but it will make our Twitter app experience more appealing to users, which then in turn kind of hoses developers out of what they had been using before. And again, you can't necessarily fault Twitter for that. They're a company and they're trying to make money, but it's something for you to think about if you're trying to build on top of somebody else's platform. That API is only as good as they're going to continue to maintain it, and it's just a risk that you're going to have to do your own analysis on as to whether you want to incorporate that company's API into your system or not.
Yeah, and so you got to think both of the business behind the social networks and then the technology behind the social networks. Business philosophies aside, I can really empathize with Twitter's tech problems because we had the same thing at Best Buy. If you've got an open API that's public and free, and all of a sudden you've got 100,000 people hammering that API, well, somebody's got to pay for the servers. And if you don't have a good business case to explain why you're now pushing out 5 gigs of data every hour on a system that does not generate a profit, well, there's a point where you're still running a for-profit business and you have to figure it out. So Twitter's fire hose, it helped them grow. And I 100% understand why they had to say eventually, sorry, we can't just let everybody consume 100% of our data just because somebody's got to pay for the servers.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I do not fault Twitter for what they did what they did with that situation. I think it's more of just for the other side of things. If you're going to be someone consuming that data, it's just something to keep in mind that you kind of have to see how these business models align. And if you're paying somebody for an API, then you kind of have a more, I don't want to say it's a guarantee, but you are more likely to see that service stick around for the long haul, as opposed to if it's, Twitter stuff was free, Best Buy stuff was free. You don't have to necessarily, you can't assume that it's going to stay around forever if you're not going to be paying for it.
Exactly. Yep. If you're not paying for it, ask yourself why not.
Yeah. And the old saying, if you're not paying for it, you're the customer. That's there
Yep.
it is. One question that we kind of touched on last time as well, but I wanted to bring it up again. It seems like a good time to do it, is securing APIs. So it might be a little confusing for our listeners, because we've been kind of bouncing back and forth between somebody that's putting out an API versus somebody that's consuming an API, because frankly, you have to do a little bit of both for most applications. Even if the API you're putting out, again, is private and you're just building an API for your apps to talk to your server, for example. But I think securing an API is something that there's a lot of different techniques and tactics to going about doing it. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts around, like, are there any kind of best practices or kind of steps maybe of like what would be like the easiest way to and simplest way to secure it, where it's not necessarily Fort Knox, and then going all the way up to being as robust as possible with your security? Like, where do you think about that kind of topic?
I think unless you are in a business of building API security, you should not build API security into your app. Instead, the API management solution that you're using, that should be a part of it. And then you decide like how much you want to turn those dials or how much you want to fund it based on your volume. There's like 3 different practices that come to mind on this. The first one is throttling. And I'm going to quiz you, Tim. Do you know what HTTP 429 is?
429, too many requests.
Isn't it the I'm a little teapot?
Is it? Okay, I'm looking it up.
Okay, we're going to Google.
429. Oh, I did 420. That's going to bring up. Yeah, too many requests. Yes.
Okay, what's I'm a little teapot?
I can't.
418. I've taken us off topic. But 429 is one I wanted. I just thought it initially got hijacked. Wrong answer. Okay,
yes.
429 is an important part, and that's throttling. You have to figure out how many requests you're willing to answer for each API user. And then if you start to think about the math of it, if I say I want to let this person do 5 requests a second, no more than 50 per minute, no more than 1,000 per hour, well, now you have to build a system that keeps track of it and that does the garbage cleanup and does the interface to let you say that Tim can hit this API 100 times a minute, Eric can only hit it 5 times a minute. Don't build that. Work on your business. Come up with a thing that makes you like actually different than the rest. Trust the API management solutions out there, like Kong, like Apogee, like Azure, like AWS. Let them do the throttling and be the one that sends your system back the HTTP 429 response. And that's where like Twitter's API is pretty cool, because what you can look at when it gives you the data, one of the pieces that it includes in the header is saying like how much more data you can request before you need to slow your roll. That's awesome. Makes the developer's life very easy. Use an API solution to do it. Another one is the authentication. So when you're connecting to an API, there's 15,000 different methods out there that you could secure it. You can have the username and password combination. You can have one-time token. You can do JSON web token. These terms if they don't mean anything to you, that's fine. Just Google like API authentication and use one of the methods out there and make sure your documentation keeps it clean. And then the last one, and it took me a while in my career before I understood the difference between authentication and authorization. Authentication says like, okay, I can come into the building. Authorization says I'm allowed in this room, but I'm not allowed in that room. So if you've got a system that you've got a whole bunch of customer data, and I'm thinking like the inner source here, the within your company, and everybody in the company should be able to know, oh, if I need to contact customer 1234, here's their email address. That's fine. But you don't need to include, oh, if I know customer 1234, here's their social security number, here's their pet name, here's this. So let your API management layer do the authorization, and then you can say this user can see this data, this user can write data, this user can't do anything. That's a really good way to think of the way to secure an API. The authentication, authorization, and throttling, and the best API management solutions out there include that out of the box.
I can't think of anything else other than that. Those are, I think, a great place to start with securing your API. And again, the cool thing with what we're talking about here with APIs is it's really contextual to what you're building. And so you kind of have to weigh these pros and cons of, again, you can build the most secure API in the world that you want. It's just going to take a lot of time, and you kind of have to weigh the importance of all these different factors in when you're building out APIs. And those are all the three tools that I was thinking about too. So I'm glad we're on the same page there.
Well, and always keeping an awareness of where the dollars go, because it's easy to look at that solution and think, oh my gosh, that's $100 a month. I really don't want to spend that because my average server bill is $80 a month. But then if you look at how much time it's going to take you to develop and maintain all of that authorization, throttling, logging is another great one, that if a vendor is consuming your API and they're trying to figure out why the heck they aren't getting any responses, well, you need a system where you can see what call they were sending to you and why you were giving them an error back. So having the solution that tracks the logging, has the error catching, notifies you when, oh, your system, your serverless node app is offline, like let the API management layer contact you. And then when you look at, oh, I get all of this for $100 a month. If I was building it myself, that would be 7 weeks of development. Well, I sure hope that your 7 weeks of development is worth more to you and the company than $100 a month.
You would think that would be good math, but
Yep. Now, and you got, if you're in a startup, maybe it's a little different. Maybe it's worth a couple weekends to save that $1,200 a year. But let yourself do, open spreadsheet, do the quick math on it, and understand maybe it's something that you can pay the $30 a month now, and then when you get your next 3 features done, then go back and bring it down from $30 a month to $2 a month. And that's like also one of the APIs are the best example of when to use serverless programming. Like in AWS, they call it Lambda. Azure, they call it functions. I used to remember what Google Cloud uses it. But APIs, they don't need to run 24/7. So the concept of serverless is just a request comes in, Amazon runs a program, gives the data back, Amazon turns off the program, and then you are only paying for those microseconds where the system runs. Well, at Caribou, we're a prime example of when to use it, because from 5 a.m. to noon, well, that's when all the requests are coming in because everybody's ordering coffee. 11:30 at night, we don't need to be paying any pennies for those servers to running because nobody's buying coffee. So serverless apps are a great example of how to build a scalable system, and APIs are their best reason for them to exist.
I love that. That kind of leads into my final topic I wanted to cover, which was how APIs have changed over the last few years. And I was kind of thinking about like GraphQL as a type of API, but I think the serverless was a really great example as well, because I mean that's something that's it's not brand new, but the concept is new enough that I think it's important to understand that. But I mean, are there other things that you've seen around the world of APIs that have been improving over the last few years that have gotten you excited?
Testing is the one that's it's kind of locked into place, and the patterns are there, whether or not that's in Ruby and you're using like VCR to record what the responses are, or in Node, knocking, I think NOCK. Basically, you're writing all of your code, and your code calls a different API. Well, every time you're running your tests in your code, you don't want to keep hammering that third-party API because eventually they'll get angry. So the tool sets, and I mean they have been around for 8 years, so it's not new, but it still feels new. Letting your system have testing and record the test in place, so you're still having very fast tests, and then you can occasionally hit that third-party system to make sure, oh, my test passed, but production's failing. This clearly shows that external API changed on me, even though they forgot to update their documentation. So I love the testing part. The API client, like Insomnia. It's insomnia.rest. Again, probably we're doing show notes, right, Tim? Otherwise, I
yes.
can talk slower. Okay.
No, you're good.
Insomnia is a fantastic client to test APIs and then give snippets of code so you can pass it around to say, why, when I do this, do I get that response? And then there's solutions like API or APImocha.com or crudcrud.com that when I'm building a system and I just need a dummy API to give me some lorem ipsum data of customers, that makes it so much faster that you never have to write your own random user generator to populate content. They've made it very easy for me to build all of my wireframes and then use a generic API in the cloud. And again, you don't really know that you need the solution until you're deep into building a admin interface and you can't figure out where to get some fake data. I've loved how those solutions have matured. And then Headless CMS has been another piece where I want to build my web interface, but I don't want to build all the giant content management solution. And the maturity of solutions like Contentful, WordPress as a headless API or Headless CMS have worked great. So if there's any like teachers out there and they're saying, how do I teach my kids APIs? I would say go to localwp.com, have them spin up and forget about a local WordPress instance, and then have them write their code against that headless CMS running on their local machine as a way to learn both how do I host an API, which is WordPress, and how do I consume API, which let's hope they're doing Node, because I like Node.
Yeah, me too. I think that's probably a great place to leave this. I mean, one thing I was going to throw on there too is I've been using this gem called Faker for that same thing lately, and that's been my tool of choice for when you're writing tests and need to come up with fake names and business names and street addresses and things like emails, all of that. It's the things that we get excited about as nerds. I mean, come on, like, but it's so cool. Like, so I love that people just thought of that concept and built out a whole robust tool that really makes and that's really like what all this is about, right? It's just people building little things that we all use and stand on top of each other to build really cool, useful things, like making sure people can get their coffee on time.
Yep. And that's where APIs come together. Lets them connect all the different systems in a place and it in one central location. It feels fast to the end user. The developers are able to focus on the thing that bids them a competitive advantage. It just, we all lift each other up.
I love it. I guess I got two more final questions to wrap this up. With the topic of APIs, are there any like resources that you turn to stay afloat and aware of any kind of changes in the community? Like, are there any like newsletters or social media groups, books, podcasts, like anything like that you kind of go send people to, or that you continually monitor to stay on top of this industry?
Kin Lane is one, and I can't remember the name that he goes by. It's KNLANE. He's at Postman now, and he's their API evangelist, but he used to have like a very generic, like everybody knew him at every API conference. And so he's on the cutting edge of what APIs are done right and what's overkill and why the heck are you doing this? Like, go back to being simple. So I really respect what Kin does in the space. And then there's two different GitHub lists that I follow, just their starred repos for me, and I look at their updates. They're both called Awesome APIs. One of them is API tools for developing your own API. and the other one is public APIs like Stripe, and I think Twitter's still on the list. But anyway, so you can see, oh, this company launched their API. What the heck can I do it? So I look at, I follow Kin, and then I look at both those lists to try to stay abreast of what's happening.
Those lists are really cool too if you're trying to get comfortable with consuming APIs. Like there's some like that have like I think the last time I looked at that list, I think they had like the NASA's like photo of the day, where just a different astronomical photo that they take, or there's other just cool things where you can be like, I don't know what I'm going to do with this, but I can try to build something to ping across it. And that it's a good way to experiment in this space for sure though.
Yes. Yeah, I was in doing research for this. I was trying to find a book to recommend, but at the end of the day, like, you don't want a book that's just about APIs. You want a cookbook. You want to know, like, here's this language that I'm trying to learn, and along the way, in teaching you that language, they'll teach you how to build the API. But a book on API for itself, like, it doesn't need to exist in the world. There's so many great APIs out there. Just go read what they are doing and then use that as your inspiration for how to design yours. Oddly enough, like, the government is has one of the best resources for how to design an API. There's an organization called the 18F, and I don't actually know what the 18F stands for, but github.com/18F includes all of their best practices that they're telling, like, every government agency, hey, if you all build it like this, it'll be super easy to consume other departments' data. So there, I consider there's the Bible of how to design an API is what 18F published.
The government puts out really like useful stuff from technology. Like the other day I shared this on LinkedIn, but I found if you go to analytics.usa.gov, it shows you all of like every government website, every federal government website. It gives you analytics on what are the most popular pages for the day. And like almost always it's like the Postal Service, people trying to track packages, or it's people looking up like IRS stuff. But sometimes it's interesting. Like there was when I looked at it a few days ago, there was one of the highest visited pages was the like Biden's announcement on Ukraine. Like it sometimes it's like the presidential proclamations and different things like that. So yeah, I don't know.
That's
like
incredible.
When
I
you
didn't
said
know that existed.
Yeah, isn't this cool? Like and it tells you, like, I'm looking at it right now. It says there's 468,740 people on government websites right now. There were 5.59 billion visits over the past 90 days. It's just like, even if you're not like a nerd around API specifically, just looking at this data, it just made me so happy that this is just a thing you can go and look at.
Cool stuff. I'll check that one out. Thanks for the tip.
You bet. Well, thank you for all of your tips here, Eric. How can people connect with you?
EricCaron.com is the best place. I'm not at the level yet of having enough stuff of putting together a newsletter, but when I come across anything cool, I'll post or link to it from there.
I need to get that in my RSS list. Assuming you have an RSS feed, which is another.
I need to get an RSS list.
Come on!
It's a serverless site right now, but I could do I can figure out how to do that. All right, 2 take-home assignments. Check out analytics.govs and put an RSS together for Tim. I'm on it.
And you can do that while you're rowing too, if you want. Eric, thank you so much for joining me today. This was awesome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Thanks to Eric Caron for joining us on the podcast today. You can learn more about Eric by visiting ericcaron.com. Show notes for this episode with all the wonderful resources Eric provided can be found at constantvariables.co. You can get in touch with the show by emailing hello@constantvariables.co, and you can also find us on Twitter at CV_podcast. Today's episode was produced by Jenny Karkowski and edited by the lovely Jordan Doust. If you can take a couple minutes to leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, we'll give you a mention in a future episode as a thank you. Visit constantvariables.co/review and we'll link you right there. This episode was brought to you by the Jed Mahonis Group. Check us out at jmg.mn.